Jack Spade and Hot Hand. Tim Riley had quite the reputation on these western frontiers. Stories for days, adventures some may call them. There isn't a saloon nationwide the town folks haven't heard of them. Some paint them as bank robbers, thieves, gamblers, fighters, drunkards, you name it. Then most often depict them as honorable, kind, righteous. The kind that would stand up for the bullies of this nation and the lawlessness of the Wild West. Ah, of course their fateful journey started over a woman, Rachel Maddock. One of the most beautiful most men have ever seen, callous, harsh, humble and kind. And thus begins the whispers of Jack Spade and Hot Hand. In the quiet, still hours of the morning, the shrill ring of an alarm pierced through the room. As Jack rolled over, the blaring sound seemed out of place, almost unreal. His blurry eyes scanned the clock, squinting to make out the time. 2:30 a.m. Groggy and troubled, he rubbed his face with both hands, the weight of exhaustion heavy in his mind. The sleep he'd been craving had evaded him for weeks. It was the kind of tired that only grief could cultivate. Unable to drift back to sleep, he swung his legs off the bed, the cold hardwood floor greeting his feet. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of streetlights outside his window, casting long shadows on the walls. He stumbled towards the door, his thoughts muddled by too many sleepless nights and too much whiskey. He reached the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter, sipping slowly. The quiet was suffocating, and yet he couldn't escape the noise inside his head. His late wife, Rachel, was gone. Missing, presumed dead, though the lack of closure had eaten at him like a relentless tide. Almost a year had passed since the night she went missing, and he still hadn't been able to move a single thing in their bedroom. Everything was exactly as she left it. The old wooden dresser, her clothes half folded on the chair, the antique mirror in the corner. The mirror. Jack hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps he had but simply couldn't bring himself to acknowledge it. The ornate frame, rich with age, seemed almost to shimmer in the dim light, as though it were alive. He blinked, his pulse quickening. The mirror swayed slightly, as though it were made of liquid. Perplexed, he took a few steps toward it, his foot catching on an empty bottle, the clink of glass startling in the silence. Reaching out with trembling hands, he placed his palm flat against the smooth surface, the cool glass pressing into his skin. He pulled his hand back quickly, his heart racing. His breath was shallow, his mind a blur. Maybe I've just had too much to drink, he thought, trying to rationalize the bizarre movement. But something inside him whispered that it was something more. He couldn't resist the pull of curiosity, and after a moment of hesitation, he reached out again. This time, he pressed his arm through the surface. A cold breeze met his skin, and then warmth. Sunlight. The air felt thick with a strange, familiar energy. His heart raced, fear and wonder mixing into a strange cocktail. "That's it, I'm dreaming," he said to himself out loud. Jack hesitated for only a moment before his curiosity overtook him. With determination now fueling his every move, he thrust himself through the mirror, his body partially sliding into the strange world on the other side. The ground beneath him was warm and uneven, like sun-baked earth. The air smelled different, thick with something wild, something untamed. A sudden smile grew on his face. His fear began to dissipate, replaced by a rush of excitement. Whatever this was, it was real. And he was through. He jumped the rest of the way through, landing with a soft thud on the unfamiliar ground. But as his feet touched down, a violent noise erupted from behind him. A train's whistle pierced the air, and in an instant, the ground beneath him seemed to shift. His body was tossed, as if thrown by some invisible force, and he rolled violently across the hard terrain. His vision blurred as he struggled to find his footing. A train. Jack reached out in desperation, grabbing onto something solid just as he was thrown off balance again. He managed to right himself, but the deafening sound of the train roaring around him made it impossible to focus on anything else. His feet dangled off the rear end of the speeding locomotive, clinging to a metal beam, his body precariously hanging on. The train surged upwards, climbing the steep incline of a mountain, its speed and unsteadiness threatening to throw him off at any moment. He clung to the edge of the speeding train, the sound of the roaring engine and grinding wheels deafening. His fingers screamed in protest, gripping the icy cold steel of the beam. The incline steepened as the train hurtled up the mountainside, every jolt threatening to send him tumbling into the abyss below. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his mind racing with panic. Then, cutting through the overwhelming noise like a knife, a voice called out, deep and commanding, yet calm. "Hold on." Startled, he whipped his head around, searching for the source. The train's rattling frame made it hard to focus, but then he saw him. At the far end of the car, gripping a metal rail with one hand and a wide-brimmed hat pressed firmly to his head with the other, stood a figure. His silhouette was shadowy, his features obscured by the dim light and the whipping wind. A long coat flapped violently behind him, and his stance was steady despite the chaos. He looked like something pulled straight out of another time, like a cowboy from a faded sepia-toned photograph. Their eyes met, though the stranger's face was unreadable in the dark. The man tipped his head slightly, an unspoken challenge or acknowledgement. He couldn't tell which. The figure's other hand tightened on the rail, and he shifted his weight, holding on against the relentless force of the train's ascent. For a moment, time seemed to stretch. The world narrowed to just the two of them, two strangers clinging to life on the back of this speeding behemoth, united by their desperation. He didn't know who this man was or why he was here. He had to be dreaming. But something about the stranger's presence filled him with a strange sense of resolve. There was no time to think, no time to question. There was only the voice that had called out and the unrelenting reality of the train. With renewed determination, he gritted his teeth, adjusted his grip, and braced himself for whatever came next. The stranger shifted his position slightly, as though preparing for something, but said nothing more. The train roared louder, and the incline grew steeper, the world around them a blur of darkness and motion. And though he didn't know where this train was headed, or what awaited him at the end of the line, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. And that gave him just enough strength to hold on. The train rattled violently as it climbed the steep incline, the screeching metal filling the air. Jack's grip faltered, but the cowboy's strong hand shot out, gripping his wrist firmly and pulling him up onto the narrow platform at the rear of the final cab. They both collapsed for a moment, the tremor of the train coursing beneath them like a living thing. "You all right?" the cowboy asked, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the train. "Yeah, I think so," Jack gasped, catching his breath. His heart raced, not just from the danger, but from the sheer impossibility of everything happening around him. The cab they were in was unlike anything he'd seen before. The roof was covered in a mirror-like metal that reflected the flickering light from the moon and stars above, while the rest of the cab was a chaotic symphony of exposed, clanking gears and steam vents. It was mesmerizing and terrifying all at once. The train lurched suddenly, and they both braced themselves against the railing. Then, as if by some unseen command, it began to slow, the mechanical cacophony subsiding into a rhythmic clatter. "It's stopping," the cowboy said, his voice low. He motioned Jack to follow him inside the cab. They crouched beneath the mirrored roof, the cowboy peering out a small, dust-covered window. The train hissed and groaned as it came to a halt, and muffled voices echoed from outside. "Quiet now," the cowboy muttered. His piercing eyes scanned the scene beyond the window. "Looks like they're unloading. When I say the word, we slip off the back and walk out with the others. Keep your head down and follow me. Got it?" Jack nodded, though questions swirled in his mind. Who were they? What was this place? But there was no time for answers. "Now," the cowboy whispered sharply. Jack followed him, dropping silently onto the dusty ground. The air smelled of soot and sweat, the sky above painted a deep indigo. Around them, shadowy figures moved, workers unloading crates and passengers stepping off the train, their faces obscured by wide-brimmed hats and long cloaks. As they joined the throng, the protagonist felt a wave of unease wash over him. His modern clothes stuck out like a sore thumb amidst the sea of leather, wool, and linen. He tried to keep his head low, focusing on the cowboy's broad shoulders ahead of him. The crowd began to disperse into what looked like an old western town straight out of a history book. Wooden buildings with slatted windows and swinging saloon doors lined a dusty main street. Gas lamps flickered weakly, casting long shadows over the bustling scene. People moved with purpose, their boots crunching on the dirt road. It was surreal, like stepping into a world frozen in time. But then he saw her. Through the shifting crowd, a figure caught his eye. His breath hitched. It can't be. Rachel. She moved gracefully, her familiar features illuminated by the soft glow of a nearby lamp. Her dark hair was tied back, and she wore a simple dress that swayed as she walked. She turned her head slightly, scanning the crowd, and their eyes locked. "Rachel," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Her gaze lingered for a moment, her brow furrowing as if in recognition. Then, just as quickly, she turned away, disappearing into the sea of faces. "Rachel." He took a step forward, his heart pounding in his chest. The cowboy grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "No time for that," he growled. "We gotta move." "No, I saw her. She's here," Jack protested, struggling against the cowboy's grip. The commotion drew attention. People began to stop and stare, their murmurs rising above the ambient noise. "Keep it down," the cowboy hissed, nodding subtly to their left. Jack followed his gaze. A group of uniformed men stood nearby, their hands resting on the revolvers holstered at their sides. Their sharp eyes scanned the crowd, their expressions unreadable but tense. Each man bore a gleaming badge on his chest. "You don't want to get pulled over by them," the cowboy said, his voice low but firm. "Trust me on that." Jack froze, his mind racing. He wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the weight of the cowboy's words and the cold steel glint of those revolvers forced him to swallow his protests. "Let's go," the cowboy said, tugging him along. The crowd's murmurs began to fade as they made their way toward the edge of town. The buildings thinned, replaced by sparse trees and open fields. Every step felt heavier, Jack's thoughts a cacophony of fear, confusion, and disbelief. They finally reached a small cabin nestled in the shadow of the forest. Its wooden frame weathered but sturdy. The cowboy pushed open the door, motioning for Jack to enter. "Inside," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Jack hesitated, glancing back toward the distant lights of the town. Somewhere in that crowd was Rachel, or someone who looked just like her. And yet, here he was, following a stranger into an unknown future. As he stepped inside the cabin, the door closed behind him with a heavy thud. The sound echoed in the quiet night, marking the beginning of something he couldn't yet comprehend.